Welcome to Careers in Discovery, where you'll meet scientists who've forged outstanding careers in biotech and hear about what they've learned along the way. This podcast is brought to you by Singular, building brilliant biotechs. For the first episode of 2024 of Careers in Discovery, I'm absolutely delighted to be kicking off with Jane Dancer. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be here.
Great to see you. Now, Jane, I normally say of such and such a company, but you're so ubiquitously involved in the biotech sector that you do lots of very different things. Tell us a bit about what you're up to these days and where you're spending most of your time.
Yeah, so Tom, that sounds like a very polite way of saying you're all over the place, but yes, I do have quite a number of plates spinning. So,
Yes.
so where I'm at the moment, I'm sort of late stage in my career. I've got what's called a portfolio, which means I don't have one job but many jobs to do. The advantage of that means it gives me a lot of flexibility, and none of these are full-time jobs, obviously. So I have more time to do other things outside work. So the main thing I spend my time on is sitting on company boards. So I chair 3 boards and I'm a non-executive director on another 2 early stage biotech companies. As well as that, I do some advisory work, sort of consulting, helping companies with their business development usually, but there's some other aspects as well. But I also find I spend quite a lot of my time just hanging out in Cambridge where I live, having coffee with people, chatting, chewing the fat, mentoring people, sometimes asking for advice myself. So, and I think for me, the boundary between what's work and what isn't work is very blurred because, you know, it's just great fun. I should say, actually, what I do when I'm not doing all that sort of stuff we were just talking about is I do, we have a canal boat, so I spend time on the canal, I ski a lot, I sail, I do a lot of walking. So for me, it's about getting work-life balance, enough time to do those things, but at the same time to keep my hand in.
Yes. And this wasn't a question I prepared you for, so sorry to dive in with one so early. But a lot of people I speak to, don't worry, it's not controversial. A lot of people I speak to who are sort of, you know, at a successful point in their career are interested in getting into more board work or portfolio work and things like that. It can be challenging. I don't know sort of how you found your way into it, and perhaps we'll talk about that, but it can be challenging to take those first steps into it. How did it happen for you? How did you end up with this portfolio?
Yeah, and something that I think will probably come up as we have our conversation is most of the work I've done right through my career has just come through networks, through people sort of approaching me and saying, Jane, how could you, do you fancy kind of taking this on? And it was very much the case with the board work. So I actually got involved. The first 2 companies who I chair came out of one of the incubators in Cambridge. In Cambridge, as I'm sure in many of the other cities in the ecosystem, there are some fabulous places for people who were starting up companies to get advice, to kind of learn how to do it. And it was through the Accelerate program at the university in Cambridge that I got introduced to these 2 companies and started working with them when they were still very young and have sort of grown with them. So that was how it started. And then from there, it's one of those things where I think once you've shown you can do it, there's no kind of shortage of opportunities. And so now, hardly a day goes by, but probably almost every week I get asked if I get involved in another board, and obviously I don't have time at the moment, but that's how it happened. So yeah, so just get out, meet people, talk to people, get involved in incubators, and you'll be able to find hopefully opportunities that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess as you say, if sort of showing you can do it gives you those opportunities, it then I imagine gives you the advantage that you can just pick the ones that seem interesting, right? And the ones where you think you can add value.
Absolutely. I mean, the other things, again, on this track is that I did actually earlier on chair a charity. So I was a trustee. So that's actually a really good way to get some experience of a different kind of board. But nevertheless, a lot of the principles are the same, the governance, the sort of, the processes. So, you can get involved in something which maybe isn't even scientific. It might be, another passion or project you have that you can do charity work on. And then there's some great groups like Women on Boards, that you can sign up to that will send through opportunities and give you an idea of the sort of things that are out there. New Role is another one, and a number of executive search firms also, provide board opportunities. So just as you say, Tom, you just need to kind of have a look, see what's out there. and hopefully something will come up which excites you and also that you're equipped to help with. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really keen to get into the story of your career, Jane, because there's a fascinating shape to it, and we'll come on to that. Because you actually started out your training and your education in plant sciences, if I understand correctly. So keen to go right back to the beginning and sort of understand why science, why plant science first of all, and then we can get into sort of why the transition into drug development and human biology and all those things, and the commercial aspects of the roles that you did as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd like to say it was all planned, each step was worked out, but actually it was very much sort of almost ad hoc, things sort of happened that led to other things, sort of organic growth. So why science? I think like most people, I loved science at school. I liked the sort of intellectual rigor of it, and the idea that you could be discovering things that no one had seen before. So I was good at biology and chemistry, so I thought biochemistry sounds like it would be a combination of the two without knowing much about it. Applied to do biochemistry at university and came to Cambridge, where I did natural science, which of course gives you breadth. Now, why plant science? Because I wasn't intending to be a plant scientist.
Right.
But what happened was in our lectures, I actually really enjoyed the lectures about plants. There seemed to be so much more to discover about a plant than there was about a human. And in fact, I subsequently went on and did a PhD on a new enzyme that had been discovered, which sort of seemed to be in the very heart of metabolism and glycolysis, and you wouldn't discover something like that in a mammal, I don't think. So there was a lot more, uncharted territory. But more than anything, I think it was the lecturers on the plant science modules before I specialized who really sort of got me fired up and inspired me. So it was about the people more than anything, and to go in a department where I really kind of, the quality of the teaching and the people there was fabulous. So yes, I ended up as a plant scientist, more by fate, and then stayed on, did a PhD in plant science, did a postdoc in plant science, and then decided to switch from academia to industry. So it might be worth talking a bit about why industry rather than academia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Started out, because, and I should say that I still do quite a lot of work with my college here in Cambridge, a women's college, Newnham, talking to students there who are at that stage in their career where they're doing their degree, some of them doing their PhD, but particularly doing their degree, deciding whether to do a PhD or not, because I think that's the first decision you have to make.
Yes.
I'm honest about that. It was not a particularly well-informed decision on my part. I sort of did it because it was the path of least resistance, and all my lecturers around me thought that was the right thing for me, and I didn't really have a clue what else was out there. These were the days before the internet, so we didn't have all the information that's available.
Of course, yes.
With hindsight, I have no regrets, but I do go back to the college and actually talk to students about the breadth of opportunities. So if you're doing a degree in science, doesn't mean you have to end up in a lab doing science. You could do many, many different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I did a degree, a PhD, decided during the course of the PhD, one thing I learned about myself was that I wasn't really equipped to do curiosity-driven research, the sort of academic research where you don't really know whether it's ever going to be any use to anyone, but it's sort of pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge. I wanted to do something which I felt was useful, was applied. So, I realized then that I was better cut out for an industrial career. But I still did a postdoc, and that was an opportunity to go and work with the best person really who was in the field at the time. And it was in Germany. So it gave me the opportunity to actually leave the safe. It's been in Cambridge for 6 years. And it was really good for me to actually have a stint abroad, and to have to sort of learn to stand on my own 2 feet and live surrounded by people speaking German. And and so I'd always recommend that, if you have the opportunity to go and live and work abroad, perhaps before you have a lot of other commitments, then definitely worth doing. And then as a plant scientist who wanted to move into industry, the obvious place for me was in agrochemicals. So I went into the agrochemical industry, came back here to Cambridge and worked for 10 years in AgChem. And during that time, I started working in research, but then moved into project management because, again, something I learned about myself was being more aware of what I was good at and what I enjoyed doing. And I'd learned that I was a very processy person. I kind of wake up in the morning and sort of map out the timeline for my day ahead, and all the contingencies, and how I'm going to get through it most efficiently. And that's the brain of a sort of project manager. I also like working with people, communicating, and again, project management is like being the conductor of an orchestra and getting everyone to sort of try and play the same tune. So I did project management, and that actually is something that's continued throughout my career, even though I didn't remain in project management. So I'll pause there. So that's the sort of plant sciencey bit. I'll come on to why I didn't stay in plant science in a minute, but just if there was anything to pick up there.
No, I think it makes total sense. I think I agree with you that spending time abroad is one of the best things people can do with their career, and especially early on, as you say, before everything else comes along and makes it more difficult. What were the things that you noticed? I haven't worked in Germany personally, but what were the sort of big differences that you noticed, or the things that you picked up there that stayed with you?
I think it made me much more sensitive to kind of different cultures, as I subsequently went on to work in France, so it was very interesting to kind of compare and contrast the two. So there were things I learned about that, but I think I actually was out in Germany when the wall came down and was very close to the East German border. So it was a real privilege to be out there and to see history being made. And actually went to Berlin shortly before the wall came down, shortly afterwards. So actually, that's one of my memories of it is having that experience. But I think generally, looking at your own country through the eyes of a foreigner, the things that I used to just accept and take for granted as having to be that way, and then seeing it done in a different way, I think was also, something which was really interesting. So yeah, it also made me actually, because when I was doing my PhD, we used to have people, foreign people from other countries come and work with us. And it wasn't until I lived abroad and had to speak a second language that I realized just how challenging it is to live and work in a country where you're not speaking it. So I've got a huge amount of respect for anyone that's bilingual, trilingual, or anyone actually that speaks, is working somewhere and not having their native tongue to rely on. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's useful, I think, to have an appreciation of what it's like to be the fish out of water rather than observe the people coming in, because I think, as you say, you get an appreciation of the things that you take for granted, but also an appreciation, especially in such a multi-racial, multicultural industry as the biotech sector, right? There's so many people that you work with who are in a culture other than their own, and it's easy to underestimate that when you're in your home culture, if you like.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's something that I've looked for, throughout my career, having had that experience. But yes,
yeah, absolutely. And I think I didn't realize, and I'm sure people who are more involved in this do, but I hadn't realized until I started working actually a little bit in agritech how similar scientifically the two industries are. But there are, of course, differences. I mean, the crop people would say that what they do is significantly more complicated than and probably so would the human health people, right? And so would the animal health people. But yeah, tell me about sort of the move from Aventis to Cambridge Antibody Technology and how that came about and that shift into human health.
Yep. So, and again, you're spot on, Tom. I mean, we used to talk about plants being our patients. I mean, I was working on fungicides mainly. Just, there are similarities. Instead of clinical trials, we had field trials, and obviously the fact that the active ingredient was being sprayed out of the back of a tractor kind of added all kinds of complexities to the development process and the amounts of tests and things we had to do. I should say just one difference was that one of the privileges actually managing the development of a product in agritech was that I used to travel around the world and visit field stations. These subsequently in my career in pharma, a trip abroad would involve an airport, a hotel, maybe a conference building or a company. back out again. Whereas in those days, I would go out and actually travel out into the countryside and get to meet farmers, and so that was something that I miss. But anyway, why the change? So what happened in the 90s, because this was when I was working in agri-tech, was the industry went through a difficult period. So it was the time before biotech was really accepted. Genetically modified crops were having a difficult time, and so what happened was there was a lot of consolidation with the industry, a lot of mergers. Right. So I actually worked for 3 different companies, but it was the same company being bought or merging. And each time there was a merger, it was like musical chairs. They would close a few sites. So inevitably, in the end, the site that I was working at here in Cambridge was closed. And as a result of that, I was offered a very good job in the headquarters in Lyon. So that was when I lived in France. So I was in the commercial team by then. So this was part of the other transition that was going on. I was gradually moving out of the lab and more over to the dark side, to the sort of business world. And it was, working across the company. And it was a really good job in that, it was giving me a lot of exposure profile. But the trouble is, the problem was that, as often happens in a career, is that it's things outside your career journey that impact on the decision. So I'd met my husband here in Cambridge shortly before I left to Germany. He followed me over to Germany when I did my postdoc there. He followed me back to Cambridge when I moved back to work in agri-tech. And then when I was offered the job in Lyon, he decided he wasn't going to move over to Lyon. He had his own career established here. So I commuted to Lyon for 2 years, living in Cambridge at the weekends and spending weekdays out in France. I could have moved over there permanently, but actually decided to take redundancy and find a job back here in Cambridge. Didn't know what I was going to do. Suspected that it would probably be pharma because that was the closest in terms of sector. But what I did do was I did an MBA. So I already had a degree and a PhD from Cambridge, but I decided to add to my collection of Cambridge degrees and take an MBA at the Judge here. To really give me a number of things. I mean, obviously to sort of help consolidate my business education. But actually it was more than that. It was to give me time to think about what I was going to do next, to actually do some more research, talk to people about what was out there, to build a network in Cambridge, because if I wanted to work here, perhaps the biggest challenge I found, rather surprisingly, moving from the ag sector across to pharma, was having spent, 5 years in academia or whatever and 10 years in industry. I was pretty well known in the ag industry. I could go to a conference and I was the person that people wanted to talk to.
Right.
Actually moving across to another sector, suddenly you're a nobody. You're the new girl at school. You're the one that's trying to get people to sort of talk to you rather than having people queuing up. And so actually getting to know people was something that I realized I needed to do, both to understand what the opportunities were here, to kind of talk about different. And I found that in Cambridge, and something that I still see, is that in the biotech pharma, people are just so helpful. I was an unknown MBA student, and yet CEOs of biotech companies were happy to have a coffee with me, a chat. I must say that I picked all of my assignments to give me an excuse to go and talk to these folk. But, to do research on the relationship between VCs and CEOs, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, I'm just grateful for the time that people gave. And it's something that I'm now in a position to give back. So that's one reason why I'm, more than happy to help other people.
Absolutely.
And through that, I discovered that business development was probably what I wanted to do. The next challenge, of course, anyone who works in BD knows that it's difficult to get a job unless you've got a deal sheet and some experience. But in order to get that deal sheet, you need to get a job. So you're into this sort of vicious cycle. And a number of people have asked me, how do you actually kind of break through that? I think there's 2 things. One is any experience that you've got that you can point at that shows that even though you haven't done a lot of deals, you have the potential is helpful. And I was fortunate that I had to negotiate rights to some data when I was doing my project in France. So that helped. But then on the other hand, you just need someone who's going to give you a break. And I was very fortunate because I knew someone who was in a year or 2 above me on the MBA. I called Richard Mason, actually, who's now CEO of CEO of Apollo here in Cambridge. But he said, oh, apply. I actually contacted him about something else, but he said, there's a job going, apply. I did. Very rigorous, interview process. So it wasn't sort of, someone, so we're going to give you the job.
Right,
but I think it just helps, to have someone to support. And of all the places I could have worked in Cambridge doing BD, I think Cambridge Antibody Technology was the place I would have chosen. So I was just very lucky to have that break. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I've spoken to a few people who are alumni of the company, and they've said very similar things.
The cat mafia. Yes.
Yeah. Before we talk about that, a couple of questions I had for you. So the MBA clearly was great for you in terms of building your network and sort of establishing you with some connections in the field. I often get asked by people who are scientists but are interested in the commercial side, whether that's because they want to run a business or whatever the reasons are, what the worth of an MBA is. And of course it's changed over the years, right? But in terms of the MBA itself, and I speak as someone who doesn't have one. I've run businesses, but I don't have one formally. What did you find in terms of the course and the qualification itself that was particularly important, or how clearly the networking was important, but what else did you take from it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was on the older side when I did it because of the reasons I took the MBA. I'd been in industry for over 10 years. I had sort of, a number of years in academia under my belt. I think what it did for me is it helped to actually formalize a lot of what I knew, but didn't really know that I knew. To give me the language and the vocabulary for business. So that was helpful. The Cambridge MBA, there's a lot of work on the sort of softer side. So I learned a lot about myself, somewhat surprisingly. You're thrust. I still to this day mentor groups of MBA students when they do an assignment in the first term, where they're put into groups that are selected by the faculty, so they don't know who they're going to be with, and then that the groups are made to be as diverse as possible, and then they have to work as a team under pressure to deliver on a consultancy project. And I did that myself all those years ago, and I still remember, the fact that it's a great way of actually working out how you fit within a team, and that sort of thing. So there was that. I think if you're thinking about doing an MBA, it's good to have had some real world experience before you actually do it, because I think with business, as you probably know better than most, Tom, it looks fine in a textbook, but it's actually a bit messy in the real world. So actually you need to have an understanding of the complexity and the sort of, real world in order to be able to get the most out of the sort of theory side of things. So therefore, but I learned a lot from my classmates. I've still kept in touch with many of them, so it actually built up a really good network there. So for me, and I wouldn't be where I was now without having had that opportunity. But it was less to do with the course itself for me, but it was more to do with a lot of the other things that came with it. So I think the other thing is I've since in my career recruited people into business development roles, and I don't think personally that an MBA is a requirement. I think actually nothing beats experience. But I think one thing an MBA tells me is that if someone has invested a year of their life, if they're doing an MBA like I did, a full-time course, and a lot of money these days, because let's face it, they're not cheap. They are serious about actually understanding business, and therefore it says something about their commitment to that. So yeah. But most people I know who've done an MBA or an executive MBA, haven't regretted it. It's actually, I would say, enriched them in some way or another.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you in terms of the getting experience first, because I know I've spoken to some people who've come out of MBAs that they've done straight after their undergrad, and you kind of talk to them about business and they have a somewhat theoretical understanding of it, but I think they almost come in with the impression that it's not emotional, that it's that it's very predictable, that it's all very logical, and obviously none of those things actually.
I was going to say, well, it is, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it that attracted you to business development in particular? Why that route for you?
Yeah, I think it came down to thinking about what I enjoyed. I've already confessed that I'm a processy person, so I like the structure, the process. Actually, running deals is like projects because you have all these different people. It's the orchestra scenario where you've got the lawyers. I'm not sure which instruments I'd give to the lawyers. We could kind of talk about that. You've got the scientists. I mean, they're probably there on the first violin or whatever. You've got the, intellectual property. You've got your stakeholders. You've got all these different people to manage and these interests, and to get them all aligned. So it is a project management job.
Yes.
But I also wanted to keep scientific foothold. So I'm never, because I'm a plant scientist, I'm not going to be equipped to run a research group in a pharma or biotech company. But I know hopefully enough science to be dangerous.
Yes.
And so to keep part of the scientific community. I think also communication. And it's an obvious one, really, if you're doing business development. And let's face it, business development is a broad spectrum of different jobs.
Yes.
Because business development can mean anything to basically what's a sales role to something that could almost be purely transactional. And those are very different parts of the process. Or as I've tended to do, you can end up doing the whole lot. But if you're going to go out and sell, if you're going to negotiate, you need to be able to communicate with people. So it's very much a sort of people person's job. So that was something else. And it's intellectually stimulating. I mean, one of my dirty secrets is that I like kind of going through contracts. I like the rigor of going through a contract and trying to work out how it could be misinterpreted or whatever, getting the drafting rights, although I would never be a lawyer. I do. So, yeah, so for all of those reasons, it was, and I didn't really know what business development was, to be honest, and it still amazes me that I've ended up doing something like that. But actually, it does tick a lot of boxes.
Yeah. I think people underestimate the intellectual challenge of it sometimes. And I think, for me, there's nothing more fascinating than trying to figure out what makes people tick. And that's a big part of it. It's such each person is such a unique puzzle that, it's endlessly fascinating from my point of view. But there you go. And clearly you did well at it. You were with Cambridge Antibody Technology for about 5 years, moved into a VP role, moved into a chief business officer role subsequently. And I would suspect that sort of the ability to build relationships that you talked about and communicate well, and the sort of project view, if you like, or the process view of things contributed to that. What do you think were the things that made you successful in business development alongside that? What do you think are the things that you learned along the way or that you did that helped you to be good at it?
I think I've been lucky as well with the companies that I landed in. And with business development, you are judged really almost entirely on your deal sheets, the deals that you've done.
Yes.
And, you can have a lot of discussions, but if, the ink doesn't get, put on the page, if the deal isn't signed, you might as well have not bothered almost. We tend to bury our dead at night, the deals that didn't happen, you're never going to get any. So there's no marks for effort almost. It's almost marks for just being able to deliver, which is really tough. And in order to deliver, you just have to have a company that has, great science, also a great team around you, because it's not an individual effort. It really is a team effort. And again, I've been very fortunate with the people, that I've worked with in all the companies. They've all been companies that have been very active in deal making. I mean, CAT, in particular, but Cellzone and F-Star as well. And with, really good people there, really good support, because without the scientist, the BD person is the person who's probably out the front in the deal, but you've got this whole army of people behind you, and without them, it's never going to happen.
Yeah, of course.
So it's I mean, I think, as I said, I was lucky, and Yeah, so being beyond that, I think it's not for the faint-hearted. It does take quite a lot of hard work.
Yes.
If you're going to do BD, you have to be prepared sometimes to work long hours. You know, if you're negotiating a deal with someone on the West Coast or in Japan or something like that, it can mean late nights or even worse, early mornings. Quite a lot of travel involved. But overall, a large element of luck, because I know some people I think are good, but they've just been unlucky in, you know, the companies they found themselves working. And it may be that with a company, as often happens, you know, there's not a lot of deals to be done to start with because the technology is not mature enough. And then suddenly, you know, you're on a sort of roll and everyone wants a piece of the action. And so you're sort of, you know, picking and choosing.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think a large part of that. And then the other thing I'd say about BD is, unlike law or intellectual property, to some extent science, it's not a job where there's a qualification. There really isn't. I mean, there's some very good courses out there where you can learn, and the best courses are ones which involve a lot of sort of role play and practical experience. But actually, the only way to learn how to negotiate and how to do business development is actually to do it. And that's why it's so difficult to get into it. You can't show someone a piece of paper apart from evidence that you've done it. You can't say, I've got a qualification in BD and therefore, you know, I can do it.
Yes.
It is very much learning on the job. And actually, sorry, this is that triggers something else in my head. I think I was lucky as well in terms of the people that I had around me that I could learn from.
Right.
Particularly, you know, at CAT, there was a whole team around me, and there were people that were senior and experienced, and having the opportunity to work alongside them to start with and to learn was also really important, to learn by doing. So, yeah, but it's been, a lot of luck involved, I would say.
Fair enough. And it's a really unfair question to ask someone why they're good at something. I apologize.
apart from, I mean, you know, I like people, I'm organized, I'm, you know, blah, blah, those things. But beyond that, you know, that in itself isn't enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, and then I suppose if we sort of think about that from a point of view of people who might want to get into business development, I suppose then one of the key things is trying to get exposed to it, right? And trying to, as you say, there's nothing like experience. So if you can get in that room, even in a periphery role, there's a different pressure in that room than there is outside of it, right? And that's sort of part, I suppose, of what the experience brings you. But you know, the advice that you'd give to people looking to pursue that sort of career, what else would you say?
Yeah, so I think, you know, I remember kind of when I was first involved in negotiations, I was sometimes given the job of being the note taker. But then, you know, I was let loose on bits of the agreement when it became clear that I could. The thing that's difficult about a negotiation is you don't want too many people in the room, and you certainly don't want people who are going to try and be helpful, but actually screw up your negotiating position by saying the complete opposite, because you know where you're going with it. So it is tricky to have, but nevertheless, you know, if you can, you know, find a way of divvying up the sort of work between you and give someone something meaningful to do so that they have a reason to be there. But it's not unusual to have, you know, in the team a BD junior alongside the main person, of course, and they're learning the trade. I think the other thing is routes into BD. As I said, I was, you know, from the MBA, I went into Cambridge and to CAT and started doing, you know, some more significant deals. But there are smaller deals that you can do. I know people, and I've heard people who started out as scientists, but actually getting involved in negotiating some of the sort of smaller agreements that are needed to support the science, you know, so smaller service agreements, things like that, which are probably a bit more straightforward than some of the more complicated big deals. But all of the elements are there, you know, the process, the kind of understanding of a legal contract, and that then provides evidence that they can do it and they want to do it and they're interested in doing it when it comes to making the step into a bigger job. Yes. I mean, tech transfer officers as well. I mean, when I started in business development, you know, was more, you know, scientific roles perhaps, but they're much more professionalized now. So they're a good, you know, opportunity. So maybe ways in which if you're in the lab and you want to move into a BD role, just look for opportunities within the current role that might expose you to some of the things which are going to be helpful and provide a foundation. in business development.
Yeah, and I suppose touching on your earlier point, think a bit more laterally about how you can prove that capability that you have even without the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. And then so we've skipped a whole big part of your career here, Jane. Apologize for that. But as we said, that sort of laterally has led on to being on the board of the UK, the BIA, being on the board of several different companies, and that sort of led you to where you are today with this portfolio career that you have. Over the course of your career as a whole, what do you think are the things that you wish you knew when you were starting out that you know now, or the things that you would advise people who are earlier in their career to think about?
Yeah, no, you did. I have been thinking a little bit about that. I think that things to think about, things that I wish I knew then, that I know now, is I think sometimes when you're maybe university or whatever, you have this idea that your career will be laser focused. You're going to do something,
right.
and actually to appreciate that life doesn't work like that. When I talk to people my age, most of us end up looking back and thinking, as I said, how did I end up here? And the things that shape my career aren't, things that necessarily I could have expected or predicted or anticipated. Yes. And I think I've ended up where I belong, but it hasn't been a straight journey there. It's sort of it's been an interesting, probably slightly convoluted journey, maybe not so much as other people's that I've met. But so there's a bit about that, a bit about, as I say, accepting that you have to balance work and life in many different ways, and that's not something that is a sort of cop out, that you're actually putting priority on other things that matter, whether it's family, partner, whatever, and that's important. It's all part of the the big scheme of things, the big picture. I think in terms of more practical things, I hadn't appreciated how important or useful it was to network and to to get to know people, and also how enjoyable it was. When I was young, I was painfully shy, so it was actually the worst thing for me would be to walk into a room of people I didn't know and then have to go up and talk to someone. Horrible. But actually, the more you do it, the more you realize that people are generally very happy to help, interesting, whatever. So as I said earlier, every position that I've had has largely come through networks, through knowing people, and more so in business development. It is a role where network is very important, being able to contact people and in different companies and so on and so forth. And I think the last thing is actually knowing yourself, because when you're starting out, you think it's all about your academic qualifications. I'm good at science, I'm good at biochemistry, whatever. I got lots of grade A's in my A levels and O levels and so on and so forth. But actually really knowing yourself and being honest about what you enjoy, what you're good at, what maybe you're not so interested in, and then not feeling you have to do something because you should or could, but really being honest with yourself about what you really want to do and what you enjoy doing, such that I've been fortunate that as I said, that still all my life the boundary between sort of work and life has been a bit blurred. But if ever I dreaded getting up in a Monday morning to go to work, that would have probably been the time to really ask myself whether I was doing the right thing, or whether actually I wasn't being honest. So yeah,
and I suppose that's a particularly important point for people who have ambitions to move into leadership roles or senior roles in their career, which not everyone does, and there's nothing wrong with that, because there comes a point in that career path where you go beyond working on the things that you know how to do from a technical point of view, right? And it becomes less about what do you know and more about who you are, how you can relate to other people, how you can lead other people, how you can support and develop other people. And if you're trying to do that in an environment that isn't right for you, or in something that doesn't inspire you, then it's going to be very difficult to pass that on to other people, I think.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. And actually, I was having a conversation along those lines with someone actually very recently. But the other thing is I'd never really until relatively late, been aware of values, how important they are. Being honest, I think maybe these days perhaps, people are much more aware and cognizant of, but just knowing what your values are and knowing whether what you're doing is aligned with those. And then a final thought, is sometimes I talk to undergraduates here in Cambridge who say, I want to do such and such, and therefore I am going to have to do a PhD, although, I'm not really, that keen on doing a PhD, but it's sort of a necessary evil to get to where I think I want to be. And then inevitably they go and do a PhD. 3 years of, independent lab research is actually quite hard work, especially if all your friends are going off to the city and earning a lot more money than you will do as an academic. And I would challenge people who say that to think about whether what they're ultimately aiming for is where they belong. Because if they have to spend time doing something that they really know that they're not going to enjoy to get to where they want to be, do they really want to be there? I'm much more an advocate of, if you're deciding what to do, just do something, that you really want to do, and it will almost naturally lead you to where you're supposed to be. I mean, within reason. You don't want to do wild and crazy stuff, but follow your instincts and your heart to some extent, not just kind of do something because you have to do it in order to be able to. Yeah, I mean, it's just something that I've seen.
Yeah, and it's very difficult, isn't it? Because people typically do that with quite a long time horizon in mind, right? They're thinking, if I want to be this person in 20 years, then I need to do this PhD now. But as you've said, things change in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, right? And, if I think about what I wanted to do when I was 21, it's very different to what's important to me now. And it's really hard to predict what that's going to be as well, right?
Yes, and we change and our circumstances change. So I'm not saying, be aimless, but on the other hand, don't be too fixated about something because, you will learn as you go and it may change. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Jane, it's been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You're very welcome. I have to ask, what did you want to do when you were 21?
What did I want to do when I was 21? It was mostly revolving around where I was going to go on a Friday night, to be honest. That was the main thing I was focused on.
Okay.
So, thank you very much, Jane.
You're very welcome, Tom. Great to talk to you.
Thanks very much for listening. Careers in Discovery is sponsored by Singular, helping you to build a brilliant biotech company. Biotech leaders spend far too much time, money and energy on hiring and people issues. Head to www.singular-biotech.com to learn how you can recruit and engage your team more effectively so you can focus on developing medicines, treating patients and saving lives.